welcome to the first episode of the Goodrum show for 2025 with me, Chris Goodrum. Big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Please keep it up and spread the word, as they say. Anyway, so I know that there's a number of you are still in this kind of weird twilight zone between Christmas and the beginning of the grind. I believe that this coming Monday is called the saddest day of the year, or the most depressing day of the year, or something like that, because you're a million miles away from, summer and all that kind of stuff. But we still have some bloody good whiskey, and hopefully you'll agree that I've got a lineup of bloody good whiskey. So firstly, a big thank you to my good friend Ian Sunderland for the samples for today's episode of the show. As you can see from the title page, we are looking at the 6 whiskies that made up the Kilkerran 20th anniversary warehouse tasting. Ian, big thank you, really very much appreciated. Obviously I wasn't able to get there for that particular tasting, but I have the samples and the luxury of maybe sort of spending a bit more time with them and seeing how they stack up. Anyway, as I have got 6 cask strength samples in front of me, obviously not a great deal of liquid as I've already pre-tasted them, I'm going to stop waffling and just introduce the lineup. Okay, so as they are numbered 1 to 6, it seems like the ideal thing to do is start with number 1. So number 1 is a triple distilled 18-year-old. This was a refill bourbon barrel distilled in April of 2006 and bottled in May of 2024 at 59.3%. Number 2 is a 19-year-old. This is a refill bourbon hogshead distilled in April of 2005, bottled May last year at 54.7%. Number 3 is a 15-year-old. This has been aged in a fresh bourbon barrel. It was distilled in May of 2009, bottled in June of last year at 56.9%. Bottling number 4 is a 10-year-old. Now this is quite intriguing, I think, because initially this was matured in a port pipe before being re-racked into a bourbon barrel in 2020. So roughly sort of 4 years. And it's something I've banged on about for quite a bit, about whiskies that are sort of matured wholly in a specific, like an Oloroso cask or port or something like that. Sometimes I think that, they could do with a bit of time, sort of, okay, monitor it, and if it's too heavy on the finishing or the cask, the port, sherry or whatever, just stick it into a refill bourbon cask and just let it sort of, gain some harmony, So it'll be interesting to see, because you don't see it very often, and I think distillers should really consider doing that more than what they actually do, rather than just going, okay, so it's a bit of a sherry monster, fine, we'll bottle it, we'll leave it, they like it like that, not everybody does, to be fair. Anyway, but I'm waffling. Let's move on. So the bottling number 5 is actually I didn't tell you anything about that one, did I? It was distilled in 2013. That's the 10-year-old, and like I said, port pipe, followed by a bourbon barrel and bottled at 54.8%. Right, now on to number 5. Number 5 is a 10-year-old again. This is a refill sherry hogshead distilled in November of 2013, bottled in September of 2024 at 58.2%. And the final bottling is a bottling of the heavily peated. This is an 8-year-old, a fresh bourbon barrel distilled in November of 2015, bottled in May of 2024 at 59.8%. So lots of interesting, lovely bottlings in the warehouse tasting, which I'm really looking forward to sharing with you guys. So let's kick off with the triple Right, okay, so bottling number 1, triple distilled, refill bourbon barrel. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Right, well, even though it's just a refill barrel, there's a lot of oak. I mean, obviously it's triple distilled spirit, it's lighter. I mean, there's a little bit of oily barley, quite a bit of fishiness, I would say. Touch of baked apple, apricot, but the oak is the dominating factor. Creamy vanilla, corn, even some rye spice notes coming through as well. And it's a bit, yeah, it's a bit OTT on the oak. Like I said, even though this is a refill cask, it really has picked up an inordinate amount of cask notes. Maybe this just needed more time, you know, and maybe the oak would have possibly sort of dropped off a bit more. Maybe. I imagine that sort of like early on and putting this into a refill bourbon cask, it was going to be sort of really oaky from the word go. But yeah, it's a bit heavy-handed on the oak, I think. Let's see what the pal's like. Pretty much as I would expect. Oak dominated, sort of lots of toffee, vanilla, sweet corn, little burnt toffee note. There's a touch of fish oil, a little bit of sort of apricot, a little bit of fruit on the mid palate. Quite masked, obviously. It's, you know, 59%, but that oak just continues. I mean, you know, even though sometimes the alcohol kind of cuts the oak off in its stride and then leaves the spirit character sort of like on the aftertaste. In this instance, not hoping hell's chance. That was never going to happen with the amount of oak that is present on this one. Anyway, let's see what a little drop of water does. Let's see if that knocks back some of the oak. Well, ish. It's taken away some of the sort of sweetness, some of the creaminess, and it's kind of, you almost get the kind of purity of oak. You know, it's like almost sniffing a piece of oak, you know, and smell that, yeah, almost smell the tannins and the grain of the oak. I mean, it's interesting, but is it particularly balanced? Well, you know, that's a sort of a prurient question, I suppose. Anyway, let's see what it passes like. Again, less creamy, less sweet, but maybe a little bit more toffee. Again, I'm getting that sort of dry tannins. A little bit of citrus now, a little bit of lemon, a little bit of vanilla essence. Again, it's got that kind of almost kind of purity of oak character, I suppose, which is interesting from, I suppose, from a technical point of view. And it's interesting to see how the triple distilled spirit kind of works with the oak, or maybe not, as the case may be. So yeah, interesting one to start with. Right, okay, so let's move on to number 2. So this is the 19-year-old refill bourbon Hogshead. Well, that's quite interesting. That's really quite dark. I mean, obviously, look, I mean, the colour is pretty light, but the aromas have this real darkness to them. Sort of malty, dark wood, toasted wood, macerated apricot, a little bit of tobacco leaf, a little bit of medicinal notes, touch of peat. I mean, that is quite wonderfully mature, it has to be said. It's lovely nose. It is quite, like I said, quite dark. I wasn't quite expecting quite so much maltiness and darkness and woodiness. There's a little citric note just coming out now. It's yeah, it's a really intriguing nose, it has to be said. Really quite complex. Let's see what the pass like. Yeah, the palate is quite dark, quite malty as well, and woody, and alcoholic, and masked, and not showing an awful lot apart from sort of this dark woodiness, a little bit of almost kind of Springbank-esque woodiness on the aftertaste, that almost kind of gritty, almost sherried tannin on the finish. Interesting. Got some lovely fishy notes now right on the aftertaste. Let's see what a little drop of water does to it. See whether that lightens the proceedings a little bit. Yeah, it's kind. Yes, it has. It's lightened it. It's not as dark. It's a little bit more citric. There's a little soapy note now coming through. Almost kind of soapy orange, sort of tangerine-y kind of note. I think I'll just, well, do you stick with it neat? Yeah, probably with on the nose anyway. Let's see what it passes like now. Yeah, that's all gone a bit wayward, or a bit of Pete Tong, as they say. There's not really anything there. It's all gone a bit kind of, you know, it's sort of lost that dark intensity. Yeah, all right, maybe there's a little bit more citrus there, a little bit more vanilla, but it's really not as interesting. And you could argue that maybe the sort of the palate was a little bit not quite one-dimensional, but not as complex as the nose was letting on. It was a bit sort of dark and woody. Yeah, there's some macerated fruit there, but it's all a bit kind of, yeah, and it hasn't taken water particularly well at all. Right, okay, so let's move on to bottling number 3. This is the 15-year-old fresh bourbon barrel. Ooh, and we're going to get a forest of oak. Let's see. Well, would you believe it? No. I mean, and here is the sort of like the real dichotomy of whiskey, is that, you know, sometimes you think, right, fresh bourbon, fresh oak, yeah, this is going to get really oaky, and, well, it isn't. This is kind of classic Kilkerran to me. It's got that lovely, salty, citric, fresh, briny, barley character. Yes, you can smell the oak, but it's all sat behind the spirit. It's got that lovely kind of dry tannins, the tartness, a little bit of peat smoke, really vibrant and intense. I mean, that is a lovely nose. That is superb. And like I said, you know, just because you think it's going to come across one way, you really got to stick your nose in the glass and sort of like, you know, find out for definite whether that's the case. And this one has definitely bucked the trend on the nose. Anyway, let's see what the passes like. Fresh, citric, zingy, tangy, citric. Look, some barley, touch of lemon cake, sort of vanilla. The oak is kind of again sitting behind the spirit. There's a touch of pepper coming through on the end, a little bit of peat smoke, but the alcohol is kind of emphasising the citric vibrancy, it has to be said. So it'll be interesting to see when we put a little drop of water with it, whether that sort of vibrancy kind of like dissipates. But neat, that is superb. That is a lovely bottling of Kilkerran. That's kind of almost classically Kilkerran as far as I'm concerned. Let's see what the nose is like now. Yeah, it's still got, it's retaining the citricness. It might be not quite so sort of zingy and tangy. There's a little bit more salt possibly. There's a little bit of rose petal, vanilla biscuits. Yeah, I mean, I still think that's actually taken water quite well, and that's still a really nice nose. A little bit more oily spirit character now. Personally, I think I would prefer the nose neat, but let's see what that's like. Fuller, slightly oilier, less coastal, less citric. Again, knocking back the alcohol has kind of sort of made the citric notes kind of less intense. But it's still got a lovely fullness to it, a lovely oiliness. There's a little fishiness there going on. There's some vanilla, oily vanilla. Yeah, I mean, I think either way, with or without water, that works really, really nicely. Personally, I prefer that neat. I think that is, so far, the standout bottle. Right, okay, moving on to the 10-year-old initial port maturation and then into bourbon. Let's see what the nose gives on this end, shall we? Lots and lots of sweet, porty, black, red fruits, rose petal potpourri. It's a bit on the confected side, it has to be said. There's a little bit of pepper, there's some vanilla, there's some salt. Do I get any distillery character? No, none whatsoever. Alright, there's a little fishiness there possibly. I think this should have gone into the bourbon barrel a lot earlier, as yeah, it's still heavily dominated by the port, and maybe that finishing in the bourbon has kind of added this kind of confected sweetness element, I think. It's really not my cup of tea at all, it has to be said. Sure, the power sign. Nose is very much, the palate is very much the same. Opens with a bit of wood smoke and then moves into that slightly confected sort of red-black fruits. There's a little bit of tannin on the mid palate, bit of pepper. That tannin bitters slightly, and that bitterness carries on throughout the end. It's not overly bitter, it's not kind of like sort of kind of bittering, so it's okay, but it's just rather one-dimensional. I'm not getting any Kilkerran character. I'm getting a bit of salt on the aftertaste, and that's pretty much about it. Let's put a little drop of water with it and let's see whether that kind of mitigates some of the intensity of the port. Yeah, it does, but it's kind of spirit is a bit soapy, and again it's become overly confected and just soapy spirit really. It's just not great. So that's right. Yeah, and that hasn't taken water well either. I think that interesting experiment. I think it's probably one that, well, I wouldn't have personally chosen to bottle this, it has to be said, but then obviously I'm not one of the powers that be at Kilkerran. To me, this should have gone into the bourbon barrel a lot earlier. It's just too porty, and it's kind of just not taken water at all well. Right, okay, so moving on to the second of the two 10-year-olds, this is the refill sherry hogshead. Let's see what that nose gives us on this then, shall we? Sherry, pruny, walnutty. It's kind of coming across like a sort of a dry PX, if you kind of follow me. There's a lot of treacle, there's a lot of dry dried fruit, dried fruits. I mean, you know what I mean. It's not, doesn't have the kind of, it's not quite as treacly as a PX, but it's more of a dry Oloroso, dry PX kind of thing, because you've got this kind of treacleness going on, but it's not sweet treacle, if you like. It's more kind of dry molasses, possibly. A bit of burnt wood, a bit of salt. Do I get any distillery character? No, not really. I mean, even though, again, this is a refill sherry, but sherry hoggy, it's still probably only, you know, been used the once before, I would imagine. But yeah, it's just all sherry. And I know there's lots of you that love this kind of stuff, you know. But to me, as you well know, and I keep saying it often enough, there's not enough balance to make it interesting. It's just sherry, really. Although that's interesting sort of sherry characteristics, it has to be said, but that's not what I'm really paying for. Anyway, let's see what the powers are. Okay, so it's got a real purity of dry Oloroso, it has to be said. It's got that sort of green nuts and sort of dry raisinade fruits, a little bit of walnut, prune, touch of treacle, pepper, distillery character. I don't get any. The sherry kind of lingers. It's not particularly masked, although it is 58%. Doesn't really taste like that. The alcohol is really well contained. Again, like I said, there's a lot of you guys that are going to kind of love this one. For me, like I said, it lacks a little bit of light and shade as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, let's see whether a little drop of water helps. Okay, yeah, so it has knocked back the sherry quite a bit in actual fact. I'm getting sort of fish oil now, I'm getting apricot, I'm getting some distillery character. I'm also getting a little whiff of sulphur as well, which is unfortunate. And again, that's my curse. I do pick up sulphur notes really, really easily. I don't know whether this is, it's got to be cask sulphur. There's also a slight soapiness, so it actually could possibly be a combination of cask sulphur, or possibly might be spirit sulphur, but I would have expected to get that with neat. But then maybe the overt sherry was kind of masking the spirit sulphur note. So yeah, I'm kind of talking myself into possibly this being spirit sulphur, and I'm probably sort of, you know, fixating on it a little bit too much, I think, because it's not overly sulphured. It's not like it's a sulphured mess. There is a blemish there, but like I said, a lot of you like guys will probably sort of like brush that one off. Anyway, let's sort of pass on. Yeah, again, there's a little bit of sulphur, but not a huge amount. It's a bit flat, it's a bit okay. It's still sherried, it's kind of slightly lighter sherry, I suppose, but it hasn't really sort of brought out any of the distillery character, really, like the nose. So again, not exactly my favoured bottling of the day. Right, okay, so let's move on to the final bottling of the day. This is the 8-year-old heavily peated. Let's see what the nose goes. Quite oily, quite petrolly, earthy, phenolic. Some lovely sweet apricot, some malt, some spice underlying all that, the peat. Bit of white fruit, some barley, some citrus. It's rounding out really quite nicely. I mean, I was tasting, I think it was it showed batch number 10 of the heavily peated at one of the it might have been Christmas, might have been November whisky tasting, I think. And I was really impressed at sort of, you know, it seemed to be finally throwing off some of that sort of youthful, fainty, rubbery kind of character, and actually rounding out into quite a lovely whiskey. And this is absolutely lovely. I think this is gorgeous. A little bit of oak, a little bit of vanilla, not as much as I would have thought, given again it's a fresh bourbon barrel, and the nose is front and centre sort of spirit character, which makes me a really happy bunny, it has to be said. Anyway, let's sort of pass on. That's delightful. A little bit more oak on the palate, but not a huge amount. Still spirit orientated, ashier peat, dusty peat, quite masked, although it's not overly intense, although I can feel the alcohol on the tongue. A touch of almond, petrol, a little bit of spice. That is lovely. I mean, again, like I said, it's now started to lose that overt sort of fainty, oily, youthful character, and we're now getting some lovely, intense peat character. That is showing absolutely wonderfully. Let's have a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Okay, so it's knocked back some of the peat a little bit. I'm getting more oily apricot, sweet apricot, vanilla, ashy peat. There's still a little bit of petrol there, but we're now sort of more fleshy Kilkerran character. And yes, all right, there's some youthful edge to it. I will give you that. I mean, we're not completely out of the shallows as yet, but you know, I really rate this. I think this is a fantastic nose. Let's see what the pass like. Okay, it's lost some of its peatiness as it's more delicately peated, and there's more American oak coming through now. Slightly more creamy oak, vanilla, not toffee. I'm getting that sort of lovely light kind of, almost kind of creme anglaise kind of vanilla character. Yes, the oak has probably come through a little bit more on the palate. Now put a little drop of water with it. But either way, I mean, I think that's really rounding into form, as they say, if I was using a football analogy. And you know, there's an interesting thing here. When I was trying to find pictures for the title page, you'll notice that all of them, bar the heavily peated, are the same because they came off an auction site. Interestingly enough, nobody seems to have put the heavily peated up for auction, and I can understand why, because that's bloody good. I imagine if you bought a bottle of that, you thought, well, bugger it, I'm going to drink it, and if you bought two, you probably thought, well, I'm going to drink the second one because it's that good. All the others, yeah, shove them out onto auction. But so weirdly enough, that's why that picture looks completely different to the other ones. But anyway, that's an aside. Right, okay, so let's sum today's episode of the show. Firstly, a very, very big thank you to my good friend Ian Sunderland for the samples for today's episode of the show. Yeah, really, really interesting, and very, very much appreciated. Would I have chosen some of these? Probably not, but I guess it kind of it's interesting at the end of the day. I mean, the triple distilled, the first bottling that we looked at, interesting to see how the triple distilled spirit works with the sort of refill bourbon, but the refill bourbon was still too intense and too heavy for the actual lightness of the spirit, and so to me wasn't that balanced at the end of the day. Bottling number 2, the 19-year-old, yeah, without water, interesting again. Nice maturity, stick some water within it, it all really fell apart, and that was quite disappointing, it has to be said. I've tasted some other older Kilkerrans which I think have been better balanced, whereas that kind of like really fell on its face. The 15-year-old, the fresh bourbon, again, I kind of like, I suppose had, and you should never really prejudge a whiskey, but I was expecting it to be sort of like heavily on the oak, but in actual fact it was really nicely balanced. It had the spirit front and centre, the new oak was sat behind it. It was a bloody good cask at the end of the day. Somebody, you know, really chose that one well, as opposed to the previous one, unfortunately. And then the port re-racked into bourbon, again interesting, but it didn't work because it had spent too long in the port already, and the 4 years in, you know, into the American oak just really wasn't long enough to kind of even out that port character, and so maybe what you should have done was either left it longer in the bourbon cask or shorter in the port cask, in my personal opinion. The sherry hogshead, again, even though a refill cask like the refill bourbon cask for the first bottling, it still totally dominated the spirit. I didn't get any spirit character whatsoever, and these are the bottlings that really do not float my boat, because they lack any balance at all. It could be for anywhere, any whiskey, any country, who knows, you know, it's just sherry at the end of the day. The final bottling, I think, was again just edged out, I think, by the 15-year-old for sort of bottling of the afternoon. Really nicely balanced, and that's what it's all about, you know, cask and spirit in harmony. And it certainly sort of did that pretty well as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, as you well know, I'm big fan of Kilkerran. I love the distillery. I love the whiskey that it produces. But you know, one's love is not blind, as they say. Some of these weren't really great, and some were. That's life. Is that a metaphor for life? I think. Anyway. I hope you've survived the sort of like the weird period, and if you're now sort of heading off back to work on Monday, hopefully it's not too arduous. So anyway, until then, I did have no more whiskey left. So until next week, good afternoon and.